Welcome to Young Adults Learning Evil, hosted by Nyrule. Young Adults Learning Evil is a gritty documentary podcast that explores the intersectionality of class, wealth, and race, and how it has played out over the past 400 years within a community. The podcast gives the world insight into how urban trauma affects a marginalized Black community inside one of America's first planned cities, New Haven, Connecticut. New Haven is also the home of one of the world's most prestigious and powerful institutions, Yale University. Subscribe to Young Adults Learning Evil on your favorite podcast platform. Here is your host, Nyrule.
Peace. My name is Nyrule, and you are listening to Young Adults Learning Evil. Today, we have a special episode, a conversation with Dr. Maysa Akbar, the leading research expert in urban-based trauma, and author of 2 books, Urban Trauma, A Legacy of Racism, and Beyondally, The Pursuit for Racial Justice. Her work in New Haven and globally addresses the negative effects of racism on Black people who are descendants of enslaved people. It is a pleasure to introduce her and her body of work to my audience. I hope you enjoyed this down-to-earth conversation. What is the inspiration behind your work?
Well, my work is focused on racial trauma. I'm a psychologist by training. It was an interesting road even to get to be a psychologist. Like I told you, my upbringing was very rocky at the least. At the age of 13, I was abandoned by my parents. And, they went back to the Caribbean. Not very different than a lot of immigrant stories here. But when they left, they forgot me and to take me with them. And so instead, what they did was that they left me here, and that was a real struggle. I was not in a stable home. I was couch surfing quite a bit, trying to find just a roof over my head. And I often remember thinking to myself, like, why me? Why did I have to struggle this way? Why did I have to suffer this way? Why am I not wanted? Why does nobody, it's hard for a kid to feel that they don't have a place, that they're just like wandering around and they're not loved and cared for. So I remember making a promise to myself one of those days, I don't even know whose house I was in or where I slept, that if I had the opportunity, I would be the difference maker for a child like me. I would be the one to listen to them, to help them, to guide them, to create a path for them. And I would be that person that I didn't feel that I had. Therapy back then, I don't even know if there was access to that. I wouldn't even have known where to get that, And so that's when my work really began, through my own personal story of struggle. And then I dedicated myself. I had 2 paths. I was either going to be in the street or I was going to be in school. And the street can be very, very seductive. And it can pull you in very quickly. And so it took a lot of willpower for me to stay in school and to keep going. But I thank God that I had a lot of mentors in my life and people who cared about me and who saw promise and potential in me and kept telling me that, to the point that then I started believing it. And then, so, I just committed myself to going to school and doing well. And then I was like, all right, you know what? I'm going to go to college. I didn't really know what psychology was, but I knew I wanted to help kids. So at first I was like, well, I'll just be a doctor. And then when I was like, I think doctors help kids, right? Like a pediatrician or something. But then when I got to school and I understood that this could be a major for me, and that there was actually a whole body, a whole field, a whole profession around mentally and behaviorally and emotionally helping children, I was like, oh, this is it. I knew it. I fell in love with it. My first psychology class, I was like, I'm going to be a psychologist. And so that's how I got into the work. And of course, it was a no-brainer that who I was going to help, who I was going to focus and dedicate my life to were children of color. That's just like the way that my trajectory, started and the way it's been, all the way up until now in my career. After I finished at Albany, I went to FAM, Florida A&M, which is the HBCU in Tallahassee, Florida, where at that time in the mid 90s was like the mecca of Black psychology. So I wanted to make sure that I was rooted and anchored in my theory and in my understanding of how to help our community. And I finished up there, and my professor was like, you have to finish your PhD. So they really pushed me and encouraged me to go and finish up. And so then I finished my PhD in St. Louis in clinical psychology with a concentration in child and adolescent. And then how I got to New Haven was because I did my pre and postdoctoral training at the Child Studies Center at Yale.
I had a similar inspiration. Mine basically took me into education because when I was studying in school, I started learning about how at the earliest ages of education that young black men are being stigmatized and how that's like the precursor to the prison pipeline. That was my inspiration to really get into helping our community and being a black male in that field. I'm like a unicorn.
Yes, you are. Like those similarities, like what inspires us to be like change agents. Like for you, it was education. For me, it was like psychology and human behavior. We're so needed in this world. Like that's why I tell the kids, like, don't give up. You know what I'm saying? Like you got to pay it forward. You got to pay it forward. And like they can be great. They're destined for greatness, actually. They just don't know it because they're beat down mentally so hard sometimes. And like you said, because they don't have role models like you, the majority of urban school districts are,
middle-class white women.
You named it. They can't see themselves in a middle-class white woman. They don't know what it looks like to be great. They can't look at them and be like, I could be you one day, right? Where they can look at you and say that. And that's tough for our black boys.
Now I'm looking at like how things are going on in pop culture, and people are always like tearing down like the public education system. If we look at it, like our public education system is ran by Karens. You know what I'm saying? So all those same things that we're seeing, like these videos of these white women overreacting about the littlest thing that black people are doing, that's happening in the classroom every single day.
That's right. And then what ends up happening is, like you said, that their black skin is weaponized. He's being aggressive. I feel threatened. I'm disruptive. Then they get over-pathologized, over-diagnosed, or into the juvenile justice system. And that begins the trajectory for a lot of our little, especially our black boys. Oh my God. Every time I do these trainings with educators, I always say to them, what happened to the fundamental quality of building a relationship?
Exactly.
Where did that go? It's a basic human connectivity and interaction. And when you can't connect with the children in your classroom because you don't understand them, and when you're afraid of them, and when you're afraid of getting to know them, those nonverbals, those microaggressions get read by the children, and they know that you're not for them. They know, and they're unique in picking up authenticity. So you can't show up saying that you care and not acting like you care. That's the double-edged sword right there, because then they're going to be like, whatever, I don't have to behave in your class because you don't care about me anyway.
And that's what happens. And then they end up getting labeled and have to be put into a self-contained class because of this ill relationship that this adult started with this little child. When you came to New Haven, is there anything unique, especially as far as the aspects of urban trauma in the black community?
Well, you got to understand that I grew up in Brooklyn in like the 80s, right? This was like the middle of, the crack epidemic. Yeah, I had a pretty tough childhood. So growing up, in a space where, I was near like the projects. I was always crossing through the projects in the Gowanus projects in Brooklyn. So I was always around like a lot of violence and a lot of community violence, a lot of poverty, a lot of drug addiction. And so when I came here to New Haven, and my reference point was the high-rise projects in New York. And when I came here and they were talking about the projects here, I was like, that's not a project. That's like a housing development. Because our projects were so different. And, but I think that by the time I got here, they were already starting to revitalize some of the neighborhoods. Perhaps some of the more notorious sort of like, housing projects. And my orientation was very different in terms of crime and in terms of like, just seeing what that looked like compared to growing up in Brooklyn during that time.
Oh, okay. Do you see any similarities?
I mean, I do. I think, when you're talking about Black pain, right? It doesn't matter where you are in this country. Like you can be in the middle of some farm fields in middle America and still keenly understand what it means to be Black in America, and keenly understand that in many ways, Black men are targets, whether you're growing up in a housing project in Brooklyn or growing up in inner city New Haven, the experiences could be almost exactly the same. And the oppression feels the same. The poverty feels the same. The lack of opportunity feels the same. It's funny, doing a lot of supportive work and doing a lot of treatment with kids in the community. There was this one young man that I was working with, and he actually was from New York also. I think he grew up in the Bronx and had relocated to New Haven. And he had said something to me that was so powerful. He was like, this ain't nothing but another hood. It's the same thing. It ain't nothing but another hood. That it's just that the New York hood is bigger. That's it. But
dynamics.
But the same type of the same dynamic, the same type of struggles that he was going through there as a teenager. He moved here and the struggles was exactly the same. And for him, it was his mom was telling him that Connecticut would be better for them. They were leveling up by moving to Connecticut, right? That's the perception when you come from New York. It's like, when you move to Connecticut, you in the burbs, right? Like like that's a step up. And he was like, yeah, nah, the hustle is exactly the same, So, I did see many similarities from that perspective. I mean, I tell his story because it shows you that from his eyes, his young eyes, he was like 16. It was no difference to him growing up in the Bronx and then coming here. At least for his lived experience, it felt exactly the same. The police still mess with him just like they did in New York. You know what I'm saying? They profile him just like they did in New York. He had to figure out how he was going to not get himself caught up into the wrong crowd, just like he had to do in New York. So it was like, it was the parallel paths were exactly the same.
Yeah, it's the same risk factors exist there as they do here.
That's right.
The funny part about that thing about Brooklyn is that there's a Brooklyn drug crew came in and moved into New Haven in the late 90s. That's how it was like a big similarity. And they always were saying like, this is just like our hood. The crime integrated into New Haven almost seamlessly.
Seamlessly, yeah. And because it was already, I think the structure was already there, right? And it's funny, like, we may be divided by boroughs, right? So let's say, Brooklyn in the 90s was probably one of the, pre-gentrification, of course, and that's a whole nother tangent that I can go on. If you look at that, you would think to yourself, okay, if I'm in a borough that is considered like one of the crime capitals of the world, then, but if you go to the Lower East Side in New York, or you go to the Upper West Side, in Manhattan, that was a whole different world. So the difference in New Haven is you don't have boroughs, but you have different neighborhoods, right? So,
distinct neighborhoods in...
Yeah. So, right. So that's the difference, right? Like you got Westville and then you got New Hallville, right? Like, but them two villas are not the same.
And then also you got New Hallville and then you go right on top of the hill and you got Prospect. So
Yes.
you got like two almost extreme levels of wealth in close proximity.
Mm-hmm. And then and then the university's sitting right in the middle of all of that,
And
right?
that is the beacon of wealth in this town.
Yes, with $1 billion endowments and the such, right? And then it's like, what the representation of that, right? So for us, the deciding factor where bridges and here is just like a park, a university, is the symbolism. It changes depending on where you are, but the oppression is exactly
And those
the
are
same.
basically the same families that have those houses on Central Park West in the Upper East Side that graduated from those same institutions.
That's right. That's exactly right. And you could see that generational wealth, right? Like, and that as a kid growing up, I was like, honestly, like as a kid growing up, I can't even tell you how many times I went into Manhattan. It was like another world for me. I don't even know how to relate to like what that kind of wealth and privilege looked like for me, because that was in my reality, so like unless I had to do like an errand or go take care of something with my parents, then I never had a reason to go. That just wasn't. And then most of all, like if they caught you in these upscale neighborhoods, they knew you didn't belong there. So now you were followed and harassed and all these other things. So very much again like kids here in New Haven. If you see a pack of kids, like, oh, let me see what these kids are trying to do. They up to no good.
My next question is, can you explain urban trauma to the audience?
Yeah, so urban trauma is a framework that I created a couple years ago and then wanted to put it into a book that could be a guide for people to be able to communicate what race-based trauma looks like. One of the reasons why I felt compelled to create the model was because I would sit around these tables, and I'm sure you sit around the same table with educators and mental health providers and, sometimes law enforcement. And it was always like, well, these kids are broken. These single-headed families and these mothers don't even show up to parent-teacher night. And these kids, all the diagnosis they got ADHD and they got this and that. And I'm like, while I was seeing children in treatment, what they were recanting to me were experiences that were rooted in racism. But they couldn't articulate that, right? Like they didn't know how to articulate it. They were just telling me the story. Like, let me tell you what happened in class. But when you have a trained ear to hear what racism looks like and sounds like and smells like and feels like, you're like, yeah, I know what this is, right? And what I was noticing was a pattern of the very same reactions, kid after kid after kid after kid. And I'm like, you know what? I gotta make sure that like our Black and brown community understands what this is, right? And I had to anchor it in history. And I'm not a trailblazer in that area. There are many historians that came before me, and I appreciate that, pay homage to them all the time, who have been able to capture the 400 plus years of traumatic history that happened, dating back to transatlantic. And that history carries on in the way that we see ourselves, in the way that we manage ourselves, in the way that this country has abused their power and privilege over the Black community. It has shown in the mental enslavement despite the freeing of physical bondage. And I wanted to be able to capture that as a trauma experience, a collective 400-year trauma experience, right? And so that piece was created. Then what happened is that I started digging more into, because I already know how people are. They're like, yeah, well, that happened 400 years ago, and I don't know why people got to keep talking about it. It's over. It's not like that anymore. People are not slaves anymore. So I was like, okay, let me see if there's like a biological or genetic factor that's at play here. And long and behold, right around 2017, a couple of years prior, they had started to do these studies around epigenetics. And basically, epigenetics identifies whether there is a particular gene that's associated with disease. Usually you could see it like in terms of, you see these types of studies in cancer research or in diabetes and heart disease research. So epigenetics is not just for mental health or for trauma, but it did move over into that realm eventually. And what they found is that there is a trauma gene. And that trauma gene, when faced with consistent exposure to traumatic experiences and toxic stress, it is variated. It is not in its original form. And that variation of that gene causes health problems, educational problems, behavioral and social emotional problems. But no one is identifying that the reason why kids are behaving the way that they're behaving, and even adults, or the fact that their education or academic prowess is interrupted, is because this gene is running amok, in their DNA. And it is expressing itself behaviorally completely different. Then I also looked at what the continued environmental factors are. And I'm like, okay, when you got kids that are continually exposed either to, community violence or continually exposed to various levels of racism, whether it's from microaggressions by their teacher, all the way to being followed in a store, all the way to being, profiled by the police, all of these combined, environmental factors causes traumatic stress into their nervous systems. And so and what that means is that basically they immediately go into a fight, flight, or freeze response. So I was like, okay. Then I started to realize, I'm like, wait a minute. I'm not just talking about historical trauma. I'm not just talking about biological trauma. I'm also talking about environmental trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right? So I'm like, this is like a culmination of 3 heavy areas of traumatic experiences culminating all into one person. And then what we want to do is be like, look how angry Black people are. I'm like, seriously? That's what we're deducing into? Nah, bro, let's go back to the science and take a look at that. And that's where the origination of urban trauma came up.
Wow. So my question to that is, especially for the epigenetics part, is that trauma may not be inside the particular home of an African American, but just living in a particular environment can trigger the trauma that has been passed down through genetics.
That's right. Or even a particular circumstance. So for example, a lot of people are like, well, if my child grew up in the suburbs or in a middle class environment, that let's say that environmental trigger is removed, right? And it's true. There are many African American families who have been able to make it out of poverty and who have been able to now, give their children a different lifestyle. They'll never probably know the experiences that their parents went through. Well, what we do know is, though, that child does have the historical trauma, right? Because that's passed down, especially if you're a descendant of, if you're of an enslaved person, right? They may very well have the variated gene, because the research shows that it takes 1.5 generations for that gene to return to its normal state. And so through fetal programming, the mother will pass that down to their child. But now you're removing, let's say, to your example, the environmental factor. So does that mean that they have urban trauma? My response to that is, well, it depends. Because, let's take my son, right? So, he grew up in a middle class situation. He never went through what my husband and I went through. But if he gets stopped by the police, what you tend to see is that the urban trauma is immediately activated, because now it is infused by that environmental factor, where all he's thinking about is, will I survive this situation? Will I come out alive? I'm a Black man in America. Will I come out alive? And so then, yeah, he could potentially, I'm not saying across the board, but he could potentially have an urban trauma reaction to that type of situation.
A few years back, where Charles Blow, his son was a student on Yale's campus, but he was accosted by Yale police and they pulled guns on him, and that,
yes,
created a traumatic experience for him.
Speak on it. That's exactly right. So here you go, a kid, right? Didn't want for nothing, grew up, with all the privileges that he could probably have and want. But boom, now that situation happens. It's going to trigger a traumatic experience.
Wow. All right. All right. So my next question is, does systemic racism perpetuate urban trauma?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think that if I had to think about, the biggest culprit of urban trauma is systemic racism, and the way that systemic and institutionalized racism has been embedded into the very fiber of this country, in everything, in the laws, in the policies, in the procedures, even in terms of like how we conceptualize this society, which is in the construct of whiteness. And so we have to operate under that regime of structural racism. And so it is a natural response to have to, exist within that level of oppression for that to be urban trauma, right?
It's a traumatic experience. Just to even survive within that is traumatic.
It is traumatic. That's exactly right.
In regards to intercommunal violence, would you say that urban trauma is like the risk factor for it, or does intercommunal violence create urban trauma?
Well, you know what? Here's what I got to say to that, right? I'm not saying that our communities are free of their problems. We already could acknowledge that, right? We know that, my feeling is that unresolved and unhealed urban trauma leads to our inability to be in community with one another. And that it is difficult or unprecedented for us to attack our oppressors. And instead what we do is that we attack one another, right? And that's psychological by nature. It is, there are many theorists that talk about, like when you get angry at work, you don't fight your boss, but you come home and you kick the dog, so the parallel there is to say that the power structure at work is your boss, right? And so if you think about the way that whether it's Black on Black violence or any other intercommunity violence, here's what I like to ground the information on. It's on statistics and truth. Because I think that there is a narrative, and oftentimes you will hear the white community or white people use that as an excuse not to have to pursue racial justice.
I agree.
Yeah, and it'll be like, well, y'all need to take care of the Black on Black crime, and the killing of one another. But here's what the statistics show. First, intercommunity violence is the norm, not the exception. It is very rare that when you look at crime statistics that you will see significant cross-community violence. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. It's not consistent. What you do tend to see is that for Black on Black crime, it's about 90% of the crime that's committed among one another is Black on Black crime. But not too far from that, about 82 to 84% is white on white crime. But how come we never talk about white on white crime? So you're talking about 6 percentage points, the difference? And so to me, it feels like an excuse to not have to face the inevitable.
In order to address Black on Black crime is the same thing as police violence. It's a societal level problem. It's only but so much we can do, especially as what you said as far as with the epigenetics. It's only but so much we can do as far as personal accountability, and then there's a societal accountability also.
Right. That's where this conversation has to go. What is society's accountability around this? And how much are we required or have been required to take on this burden? And the truth about racism, like a close colleague of mine says all the time, Mercy Quay, she says, racism is not a Black people problem. We didn't create racism. We don't perpetuate racism. We're not the holders of privilege and power. We don't benefit from it. White people created racism as a social construct to benefit them. And in order to uphold, they're the beneficiaries of racism. Right? And so if you develop the construct If you nurtured the construct, you lifted and embedded it into every fiber of this country, then you have got to be at the forefront of the fight to dismantle it. There is no other option.
All right. And my next question is, what are the consequences of not addressing urban trauma?
Well, I think what you tend to see is that we can, in many different ways, become very self-destructive because there is no clear path to healing. When you don't understand how you got here, and when you don't understand how to get out of where you are, then it becomes very debilitating. And you almost hit a point of desperation, hopelessness, and despair. Because you don't know what the steps are. Those steps haven't been shared. You haven't been privy to understanding, like how to climb your way out of and claw your way out of the situation that you're in. If you're experiencing extreme poverty and you don't know where your next meal is coming from and you're just trying to survive, it's really difficult to be like, oh yes, I'm going to go to therapy so that I can become self-actualized tomorrow. That's just almost impossible. What I have talked about in terms of urban trauma is that we have to know the signs and the indicators. And so with urban trauma, the areas that we have to be knowledgeable about is what are the characteristics. So that means like when you have urban trauma, how does that manifest itself, in that person? And so there are 6 characteristics associated to urban trauma. What I say to people when I talk about the characteristics is that in isolation, people may be like, oh yeah, I have that. But when you put them together and you apply context means like understanding the history, the biology, all these different pieces, then you understand that that's where these things are coming from. So the first one is like unadulterated anger. And you tend to see that, right? Like right now, everybody's like, oh, the protesters, they're so angry. They're so enraged. Yeah, they got a lot to be angry about, right? The second one is mistrust, not trusting people, not trusting systems, not trusting that anybody has their best interests at heart. And how can you trust when you've been let down? How can you even trust when this country can't even acknowledge what happened to Black people? You know what I'm saying? Like they won't even come to terms and validate the experiences that Black folks have had in this country, right?
They only want to romanticize it.
Yes. Or act like it happened so long ago that they're confused about why it's still a topic of discussion, right?
Yeah, like it has no effect on the present day's conditions.
Correct. That's why that biology piece was so important, right? And for us to be educated, we have got to be educated to be able to say, no, this is why we're still talking about it. This is how it lives within me. And this is how it manifests itself if I don't take care of it, right? The other piece of it is manipulation. And what I tell people is that when you have urban trauma and you're manipulating, it's because you're trying to survive. All you're doing is applying every survival mechanism you have in order to get by. In fact, you got to manipulate, because if not, then how else, it's like they say, the hustle is real, right? Hustling becomes part of what you have to do because nothing's ever given to you. Nothing's ever easy. Nothing ever just comes, like paths are not just open. Opportunities are not just open. You got to take everything. That's where the manipulation comes into play. Fear. You fear for your life. You fear for your safety. You have no agency. It's so difficult to just be. Can you imagine just being able to just be? And sometimes what I write in the book is like that you fear your failures as much as you fear your success. Because, don't let you be successful, then you become a target, right? So it is the fear, it can sometimes be paralyzing in terms of, how do you navigate this world where you didn't write the script? And you're just trying to figure out, how do I move from this point to this next point, right? And the last two are perception is the next one, which means that like in a lot of ways, it's kind of that saying like our perception is our reality. And when we think about like the worldview of the Black experience, we have to think about that what that's tainted with is that it's tainted with white superiority and white supremacy, right? Period. And so you move about the world, thinking and believing that every situation that you're in, it's almost like it roots a sense of paranoia in you. And the paranoia is like, that somebody's out to get you, or that you're not good enough. You're not enough to be, whatever it is that you want to be. So that perception can take root, and sometimes it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then the last one is rejection. And, I think that, again, the ultimate rejection is never being accepted. Something that I have that's different being from the Caribbean is that I have my island nation, right? And to be able to go back to
the culture that you are part of, like we're always othered in America. Black people in America are always othered. So we're never part of the mainstream. And it's almost like cultural imperialism. So we have to look at white culture as something that's valid, and ours is seen as less valid.
It's the idea of white superiority and black inferiority. That's the juxtapose that's been sold, right? That's the narrative. It's so difficult, right? Because I think being African American, you're like, well, what home am I going back to? I don't belong here, but where do I belong? I don't belong anywhere else either, right? And so it's like this perpetual cycle of feeling like you're always othered, and that belonging isn't part of the experience for you anywhere, right? And so, that's why I have to always also acknowledge my privilege around that, personally, where it's like when I've had my limit, I can go home and I can be around my people. I can hear my music. I can eat my food. I can be in the spirit of, of what it is. We ain't without our problems either. We got our, what I'm saying? Colorism runs rampant. We got a bunch of different issues. But at the end of the day, that feeling of being home is like no other. And that's the piece that is rooted in the rejection. Like you never feel wanted. You never feel needed. You never feel like you're part of something. And that's tough, man. That's the ultimate. People say in the research that a rejection injury is far worse and far more painful than any physical injury you could ever experience. Imagine that.
And that happens to us in America from our earliest ages.
Yes.
Wow. All right. All right. So my next question is, does systemic racism perpetuate urban trauma?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that if I had to think about, the biggest culprit of urban trauma is systemic racism, and the way that systemic and institutionalized racism has been embedded into the very fiber of this country, in everything, in the laws, in the policies, in the procedures, even in terms of like how we conceptualize this society, which is in the construct of whiteness. And so we have to operate under that regime of structural racism. And so it is a natural response to have to, exist within that level of oppression for that to be urban trauma, right? Like,
yeah, it's a traumatic experience just to even survive.
It is traumatic. That's exactly right.
All right. Next question I have for you is, how do we start to heal from urban trauma?
I think that it's a complex process, but it is very doable. And what I would say to our community is that the first thing that we need to do is root ourselves in our racial identity. And I know that that's tough because that's what we've been talking about. Like, right? How do you create identity in a place where belongingness is sketchy at best? But we've got to start to come to terms with the fact that we are just as American as anybody else, and that this land belongs to us just as much as anybody else. And so then what does that mean in terms of creating identity? And we can become very creative in the way that looks. And I think that many people have. And they've rooted themselves into their African roots, in their Pan-Africanism, in the teachings of historical strong figures that are role models, that are scientists, that are innovators. And creating that strong identity is one of the primary areas that has to happen. And so therefore, socialization around race has to happen in schools, in our community, in our families, so that the next generation that is coming up is not confused about who they are. When they're anchored in their identity, they have more self-sufficiency, self-esteem, and they have more agency about who they are. People then can't create narratives about who they are. They don't believe that. If I'm anchored in my racial identity, I don't care what you say about me. I already know who I am, right? So that's where the healing begins. And then we have to make sure that we're tackling those behaviors that I talked about, those characteristics, and managing them and not letting them control us, but instead we're controlling them. And those characteristics are really important because they live within us. So learning how to lean into them, learning to accept that we have to cohabitate together, like I say, they live with you, you can't get rid of them, but you can certainly be the one who leads the path in terms of how you're going to show up in different spaces. I know that our community has a lot of trouble in terms of seeking mental health and therapy, but at this point, I'm hoping that the stigma around mental health has begun to dismantle itself and that we are more open to thinking about seeking the right culturally competent treatment. Because, when you are having to go at this by yourself, it's hard. And we need our village to be able to do it. And your therapist could be part of that village. So decontextualizing the idea that therapy is associated to weakness is going to be really important. The other place where I think you can find that socialization and that village support is in the faith-based community. I mean, our faith has always been very important, and faith means different things for different people. And I would say that the last thing is moving ourselves from a mentality where we're always trying to survive into a space of thriving. And we do that, it is so important to be able to move from that, and it's a mentality, it's a mindset, right? If I believe in my mind that I am living in scarcity, then every space that I occupy is going to be like crabs in a barrel. I'm going to try to take everything and hoard everything because I'm going to think somebody else is going to take it from me. And I don't want to share that. I don't want to share the little bit that I got.
That is so true when you're coming from an environment where there's scarcity to an environment where there's abundance. That's what I learned as being a teacher, going from teaching in New Haven to teaching out in the Seattle area, that they have so much more money and resources that they were like, whatever you need or whatever you want, just ask for it and we'll try to provide it for you. Where in New Haven, do what you have to do with what you have. And asking for more resources wasn't my option. So when you got like the difference in those dynamics of knowing that you have abundance and the confidence that gives you, it's a different world.
It is a different world, and you're able to appreciate that there really is enough, and that if you can operate from a space of abundance, then you attract abundance into your life. And that's for real. And when you operate from a place of scarcity, you attract scarcity into your life. And so, we've got to start there. And there are other principles that I have under surviving, like, let's say another one, just as a quick example, is like perpetually being in dysfunctional relationships. Why are you doing that? It's dysfunctional. That person ain't right for you. When you're in pain all the time, that this is not a good, healthy relationship for you. You are deserving of more. But because we operate from scarcity, we don't believe we're deserving of more.
Just feeling lucky about being in that position.
Yes. And just being like, well, let me just try to make this work. Why? When you can move from a dysfunctional relationship to healthy attachments, now you are not just creating a relationship and thriving in a relationship that is healthy for you and you healthy for that person. Now you're able to build something with your partner, with somebody that you love, that you can invest in, that will nurture you, that will grow you, that won't dim your light, but will make sure that you're shining. You know what I'm saying? The minute that you feel that somebody's dimming your light, that's toxic. Cut it out. You should never experience life being in toxicity. And we know when it's toxic. We just sometimes don't have the courage because urban trauma gets in the way, and it makes us believe that we are not deserving of more. And what I got to say is that the devil is a liar. We should not be listening to that voice that tells us that we're not enough. We are more than enough. We have been more than enough. Ain't no people in this world that have survived what we have survived. That alone tells you that we are unique in our existence in this world and uniquely positioned to be beyond, kings and queens. Uniquely positioned. We just got to claim our rightful place in this world. But we scared to do that.
Yep. It's just acknowledging, like you said, just knowing who we are and respecting who we are and what we've been through. Right. And that will be able to get us through what we've been going through. No one can define us for ourselves. We can define ourselves for ourselves.
That's right. And that mentality moves us into abundance. So, the thing about trauma and that is, I think, very special is that, and I always say this, is that what we do know about traumatic experiences is that over 90% of the world population experiences one type of trauma at some point or the other. It is the extent of the trauma that will impact how debilitating it'll be to us, right? That's number one. But especially for African Americans and for the Black community, I always say that the other side of trauma is resilience.
Yes.
And we've had no choice but to develop resilience, right? Like by hook or by crook, It
was no other way.
It was no other way. And so that's the thing, right? That you can break the cycles and the legacy of racism within your family and the way that looks, right? And the way that you can't break it for what society is doing, but the way that it mentally affects us, we can work to leverage that resilience to do better and be better, and to take that energy and to put it into something very positive.
So my next question is, how can those who come from different backgrounds and haven't experienced the trauma directly help those who have been affected directly from generational trauma and systemic racism?
Well, I think, there are different sort of groups, right? So there are people of color, non-Black identifying people of color that go through their own sets of trauma. And for the purpose of my book, I made a decision and was very clear about making sure that I wanted to lift the Black community in helping understand the traumatic experiences and not water that with other people of color. Now, I'm not saying that other people of color don't go through their own trauma and their own traumatic experiences, but I believe that, fundamentally my value system is acknowledging who has always had to be at the forefront of the fight, right? And that other POCs in this country have only benefited from every Black battle that has happened, from emancipation to the Civil War to Jim Crow, to now Black Lives Matter. Every benefit that other POCs have is because Black people have been at the start, the beginning, the end, the middle of that fight. And so what I have to say is that it is time for solidarity. For other POCs, listen to me and listen to me clear. We have no time for the oppression Olympics right now. We ain't got no time for that. We have to move and activate quickly because in terms of numbers, sheer numbers alone, we would be able to make a substantial change in this country if we came together and focused on one goal, focused on one position, and we would all benefit from coming together. There will always be a benefit to all people when Black people can win, period. To allies, to white allies, what I say is, if this has been a moment of an awakening for you, I commend you, I applaud you, and now your learning curve begins and your runway is not long. So we need you to educate yourself and educate yourself quickly. Please do not depend on your Black colleagues, your Black friends, your Black spouse, your Black neighbor, or anyone else to educate you. That is solely your responsibility and you must do it on your own. They can always be a resource to you, but please don't burden them above and beyond all the other burdens that they have to educate you. And take the opportunity to learn about what allyship is truly about and about anchoring your allyship in racial justice. One of the new projects that I'm working on is a new book called Beyondally, The Pursuit of Racial Justice, because I wanted to give white allies a roadmap into how this is done. I think oftentimes when people are confused, when they're not sure, when they're just coming to terms with something that has existed, but they haven't had to, because of their privilege, really focus on it, it's difficult to know where to start. So what the book provides is a step-by-step guide on the allyship process. And then it helps you to create identity around allyship through looking at this allyship identity model that I created. And there are stages within that model where it gives you a beginning stage, a supporter, all the way to an enhanced stage of an equity broker. So that book comes out. I'm excited about it. I think it is going to be a game changer for many white allies. And I'm hoping that we are able to move in this work together. And that's what that book is all about.
And where can they purchase the book?
Well, it's going to come out on Amazon first, and then they would be able to on all the other major, Barnes and Nobles and all the other major outlets on my website, MaysaAkbar.com or urbantrauma.com. They would be able to purchase it there. And, I'm hoping that I get a lot of support for purchasing this book and that it starts a movement, honestly, on this process of allyship, because we don't have to guess at it. I think the other reason why I was so intentional about writing this book is because I wanted to make sure that if white folks were going to ally correctly, they were able to ally from the voice of a person of color, as opposed to them determining what allyship and defining what allyship looks like. So that was very important for me. And that's the voice that the book has. It's creating allyship and creating that roadmap the way that we need you to do it, not the way that you would consider to do it on your own.
And see, that's funny that you made that point. The author that wrote the book, White Fragility, D'Angelo, she was saying the same thing as far as white people are looking at her for information as far as race relations. And she's telling them that she had to sit down at the feet of other people of color and black scholars to learn that information. Instead of going to her, they can always go to those same people that she went to.
That's right. I mean, that, and one of the things that I appreciate about Robin DiAngelo is her acknowledgement of these different areas. And, this is precisely why it was so important for me to write this book from our voice, right? And I took the time to listen. I had 7 community reviewers read this book before it came out, because I wanted to make sure that I captured the voice of every person of color, all from different ethnicities, right? Like, what's your voice if you're Asian? What's your voice if you're Black? What's your voice if you're Latinx? And so that this is written by a person of color, while I'm the author, there are so many different voices that are coming through in this book. And so, if you want to learn how to ally correctly, this is the book you got to get, right? Like, if you want to start your book club or your affinity group, or whatever it is, this is a point of discussion, because it is coming from precisely that platform, from precisely that vantage point that I think that some of the other books that are out right now don't have.
I appreciate it, Dr. Akbar. Very, very informative. Best of luck with your book release. Whatever we can do on Young Adults Learning Evil's podcast to help you get your message out, you have an open invitation.
Oh, thank you so much. I have appreciated this time with you. You've been fantastic. I hope that, this message lands both for our community and others. What I've been telling our community is hey, look, this new book that's coming out too, this is your ability to be able to say, while I can't educate you, here's my gift to you, here, read this, and so it's a way for us to also leverage our support of one another and for our collective voice to be heard. So I appreciate this time and for you giving me this platform to be able to talk about something that clearly you can see I'm very passionate about.
Thank you for listening to Young Adults Learning Evil. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Visit our Patreon page and learn how you can support and stay in tune with the movement. Till next time, peace.